She arrived in the Montana wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and a child growing beneath her heart. No husband, no family, no money, just raw determination and hands willing to bleed for a dream that seemed impossible to everyone except her. While other women sought comfort in parlors and protection from men, she chose timber and nails, building her future one board at a time. Then Clayton Hartwell rode into her clearing, a wealthy rancher's son who'd never known want or watched. A woman split her own firewood. He came expecting to find some desperate soul needing rescue, but instead discovered something that shook him to his core, a woman who didn't need saving at all. What happens when unstoppable will meets immovable? Pride. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The weathered cross in Eleanor May Sullivan's hands had seen better days, much like the woman who clutched it now. Her father's rough fingers had carved each groove 20 years ago, back when faith seemed as solid as the oak it was hewn from. Now, sitting on the half-finished porch of her cabin, she traced those familiar lines and wondered if the Almighty had forgotten her address somewhere between Boston and this God-forsaken patch of Montana wilderness. 3 months. 3 months. Since she'd stepped off that dusty stagecoach in Willowbrook with nothing but a carpet bag, $8, and a belly that would soon tell the world her shame. The driver had looked at her like she'd lost her mind when she'd asked him to drop her at the land office instead of the boarding house. Maybe she had lost her mind. Sane women didn't buy 40 acres of untamed prairie with their last coin. Sane women didn't set out to build a homestead with their bare hands while carrying a child, but Eleanor had stopped being sane the night Charles Whitmore walked out of their Boston brownstone, leaving nothing behind but divorce papers and the echo of his disgusted voice. I won't raise another man's bastard. She hadn't told him the child was his own. Pride, perhaps, or maybe just the cold realization that a man who could abandon his wife so easily wasn't worth the breath it would take to argue. Let him think what he would. She knew the truth, and that would have to be enough. The morning sun climbed higher over the Rockies, painting the grassland in shades of gold that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with this harsh country in the first place. Here, a woman's worth wasn't measured by the cut of her dress or the number of calling cards on her silver tray. Here, survival mattered more than society's whispered judgments. Eleanor set the cross aside and picked up her saw, running her thumb along the sharp teeth. Calloused hands, something that would have horrified her Boston friends, gripped the handle with practiced ease. She'd learned quickly that the wilderness didn't care about her delicate upbringing or her finishing school manners. It demanded strength, and she'd found reserves she never knew existed. The cabin's frame rose around her like the skeleton of some great beast, each beam a testament to her determination. She'd started with the foundation stones, hauling them from the creek bed one by one until her back screamed and her shoulders burned. Then came the floor joists. Cut from lodgepole pines, she'd felled herself with an axe that felt foreign in her hands for the first few weeks. Now, 6 weeks into the construction, the walls stood waist-high, and she could finally envision the finished home. Small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace that would keep her and the baby warm through the brutal Montana winters. A covered porch where she could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set over the mountains. A root cellar where she'd store the vegetables from the garden she planned to plant come spring. The baby stirred beneath her ribs, a gentle flutter that never failed to make her smile. 5 months along now, and her condition was becoming impossible. To hide beneath loose clothing. Not that there was anyone around to notice. Her nearest neighbors, the Kowalskis, lived 6 miles east, and she'd only met them once, when Johann had ridden over to introduce himself and offer help. She'd politely declined. Independence had always been her weakness and her strength. Even as a child, she'd preferred climbing trees to playing with dolls, much to her mother's dismay. Eleanor, ladies don't soil their skirts, had been the constant refrain of her youth, followed by endless lessons in proper deportment and social graces that felt as constraining as a too-tight corset. Her father had been different. James Sullivan understood his daughter's wild heart, perhaps because it reminded him of his own younger days before society and marriage had tamed him into a proper Boston businessman. He'd taught her to whittle wood and read the weather, to find her way by the stars and trust her instincts. Most importantly, he'd taught her that a person's worth came from their actions, not their circumstances. Those lessons served her well now as she measured and cut the next wall plank. The morning air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, so different from the coal smoke and horse manure that had perfumed Boston's streets. Here she could breathe deeply without tasting someone else's sorrow. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from her work. A lone rider emerged. From the stand of aspens to the south, sitting tall in his saddle with the easy confidence of a man born to the frontier. Even from a distance, she could see the quality of his horse and tack, definitely not a drifter or homesteader like herself. Eleanor set down her saw and smoothed her work dress, suddenly conscious of the sawdust in her hair and the dirt under. Her fingernails? Old habits died hard, apparently. Part of her would always be the Boston socialite who changed clothes 3 times a day and never appeared in public without gloves. As the rider drew closer, she could make out his features more clearly. Young, perhaps 25 or 30, with dark hair beneath a well-made hat and clothes that spoke of money. His horse was a fine bay gelding that probably cost more than she'd paid for her entire 40 acres. He reined in at the edge of her clearing, his eyes taking in the partially built cabin, the neat stacks of lumber, and finally settling on her with undisguised surprise. She supposed she made quite a picture, a pregnant woman in work clothes, hammer in hand, standing amid the chaos of construction like some pioneer Madonna. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice carried the slight drawl of someone raised in the West, but educated back east. "I'm Clayton Hartwell. My family owns the Circle H Ranch about 10 miles north of here." Eleanor nodded politely, though the name meant nothing to her. She'd made it a point not to learn too much about her neighbors, preferring the anonymity her isolation provided. "Eleanor Sullivan. Good morning, Mr. Hartwell." His gaze swept over the construction site again, lingering on her rounded belly before returning to her face. She could practically see the questions forming behind his dark eyes, but he was too much of a gentleman to voice them directly. "Quite an undertaking you have here," he said finally. "Building a cabin is hard work, even for a man with a full crew." The implication hung between them like morning mist, that a woman, especially a pregnant woman, had no business attempting such a task alone. Eleanor had heard variations of this sentiment from every man she'd encountered since arriving in Montana, and her response had become as polished as a riverstone. "I find that most things worth having require hard work, Mr. Hartwell." "I don't. Mind the effort." Something flickered in his expression. Respect, perhaps, or maybe just curiosity about this strange woman who'd appeared in his territory like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the frontier landscape. Eleanor found herself studying his face in return, noting the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners and the firm set of his jaw that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way. Wealthy rancher's son, she thought, probably never worked. A day of real labor in his life, the type of man who saw women as delicate creatures in need of protection and guidance. She'd married one of those once, and look how that had turned out. "I don't mean to intrude," Clayton said, dismounting with fluid grace, "but I was riding the boundary lines and noticed the smoke from your chimney. Wanted to make sure everything was all right." Eleanor almost smiled at the diplomatic lie. There was no smoke. She hadn't lit a fire in the fireplace for 3 days, and the boundary between his family's ranch and her property was probably closer to 5 miles than the 10 he'd claimed. He'd come out of curiosity, plain and simple, drawn by the novelty of a woman building alone in the wilderness. "Everything's fine, thank you." I appreciate your concern, but as you can see, I'm managing quite well on my own. The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly forceful kick, making her wince and press a hand to her side. Clayton noticed, of course, his frown deepening with what looked like genuine worry. "Ma'am, if you don't mind my saying so, this doesn't seem like the safest place for a woman in your condition. Winter comes early and hard in these parts, and you're pretty far from help if something goes wrong." There it was. The assumption that she needed rescuing, that her situation was temporary insanity rather than deliberate choice. Eleanor straightened to her full height, which even at 5 feet 6 inches was impressive when backed by pure determination. "Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate your concern, but I assure you I've thought this through very carefully. I have supplies, enough to last through winter, and I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself and my child. But surely you have family, a husband who could—" "I have no husband." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, cutting through his polite inquiry like her saw through pine. "And my family is back east, where they prefer I remain a distant memory." The silence that followed stretched taut between them, filled with unspoken questions and assumptions. Eleanor could see him trying to piece together her story, the obvious refinement in her speech and bearing, the expensive bone hairpins holding back her dark hair, the quality of her work dress despite its practical cut. She didn't fit any of the usual categories. Not a fallen woman seeking redemption, not a widow making do, not a pioneer wife building alongside her husband. She was something new, something he couldn't quite understand, and that clearly bothered him more than he cared to admit. "I should let you get back to your work," he said finally, though he made no move to remount his horse. "But if you need anything, supplies, help with the heavy lifting, the Circle H isn't far. We'd be happy to lend a hand." Eleanor studied his face, looking for the calculation she'd learned to expect from men. The assumption that helping her would somehow obligate her to them, that kindness always came with strings attached. But Clayton Hartwell's expression seemed genuinely concerned, without the predatory edge she'd grown accustomed to recognizing. Still, she'd learned to trust her own strength above all else. "That's very kind, but I prefer to handle things myself. I find that way there's no confusion about what belongs to whom." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, as if he recognized something familiar in her fierce independence. "Fair enough, Miss Sullivan, but the offer stands all the same." He touched his hat brim again and swung back into the saddle with the easy grace of a man born to horseback. As he gathered his reins, he looked down at her one more time, and Eleanor found herself caught by the intensity of his gaze. "For what?" "It's worth," he said quietly. "I think what you're doing here takes considerable courage. Not many people would have the backbone to start over in a place like this." Before she could respond, he'd wheeled his horse around and was riding back, the way he'd come, leaving Eleanor standing in her half-built cabin with her heart beating just a little faster than it should have been. She watched until he disappeared into the aspens, then shook her head and picked up her saw. Men like Clayton Hartwell were exactly the kind of complication she'd come to Montana to avoid. Charming, confident, and accustomed to solving problems with money and influence rather than hard work and determination. But as she resumed cutting planks for the cabin wall, she found herself glancing occasionally toward the trees where he'd vanished, and wondering, despite herself, what had really brought him to her clearing on this particular morning. Clayton Hartwell had always prided himself on being a man who understood his place in the world. The silver pocket watch ticking steadily against his vest was more than just a timepiece. It was a reminder of 4 generations of Hartwell men who'd built the Circle H from nothing into one of the most prosperous ranches in Montana territory. His great-grandfather's initials were still visible on the worn case, a testament to legacy and the weight of expectation that came with the family name. But as he rode away from Eleanor Sullivan's clearing that morning, the familiar comfort of that legacy felt more like a burden pressing against his chest. 3 days had passed since their first meeting, and he'd found himself taking longer routes during his daily rides, always managing to pass by her property under the pretense of checking fence lines or looking for strays. Each time, he told himself it was simple, neighborly concern. A pregnant woman alone in the wilderness was bound to need help eventually, and when she did, he wanted to be close enough to provide it. The truth was more complicated, and Clayton wasn't entirely comfortable examining it too closely. The morning sun cast long shadows as he approached her clearing again, the sound of steady hammering reaching him before the cabin came into view. She was on the roof this time, her dark hair pinned back beneath a wide-brimmed hat as she nailed shingles with methodical precision. The sight made his chest tight with worry and something else he refused to name. "Miss Sullivan," he called out, dismounting and tethering his horse to a nearby pine. "That looks like dangerous work for someone in your condition." Eleanor paused in her hammering and looked down at him, one hand shading her eyes against the morning glare. Even from this angle, he could see the stubborn set of her jaw. "Good morning, Mr. Hartwell. I wasn't expecting another visit so soon." There was a subtle reproach in her tone, a reminder that his frequent appearances weren't going unnoticed. Clayton felt heat rise in his cheeks. When had he become the sort of man who made a nuisance of himself around women? "I was checking the creek boundary," he said, which was true enough, though it didn't explain why he'd taken a mile-long detour to get there. "Noticed you were working on the roof. That's not something to tackle alone, especially for a pregnant woman," she finished, her voice carrying a note of tired exasperation. "Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate your concern, but I've been climbing trees and fixing roofs since I was 12 years old. My condition doesn't make me helpless." To prove her point, she turned back to her work, driving the next nail home with 3 precise strikes. Clayton watched the fluid motion of her arm, the confident way she positioned each shingle, and felt his assumptions about proper feminine behavior shift uncomfortably. "At least let me spot you," he called up. "If you slip, I won't slip." But even as she said it, her foot shifted slightly on the angled roof, and for a heart-stopping moment, she swayed before catching her balance. Clayton was moving before he consciously decided to, scaling the ladder she'd propped against the cabin wall with surprising speed for a man more accustomed to horseback than construction work. He reached the roof edge just as Eleanor was settling back into position, her face pale beneath the brim of her hat. "I'm fine," she said quickly, but her voice held a tremor that belied the words. "I'm sure you are." Clayton positioned himself on the ladder so he could reach her if needed, his hands gripping the rungs firmly. "But humor me anyway. My mother raised me to be helpful to ladies, and she'd box my ears if she knew I'd let a pregnant woman work alone on a roof." Eleanor glanced at him sideways, and for a moment he thought she might order him back down the ladder. Then something in her expression softened slightly. "Your mother sounds like a formidable woman." "She is. Runs the household accounts, manages the ranch's social obligations, and can stare down a charging bull when the mood strikes her." Clayton grinned. "She'd like you, I think. She has a soft spot for women who don't back down from a challenge." "Does she know you're out here pestering lone homesteaders instead of tending to ranch business?" The question was delivered with enough dry humor to take the sting out, and Clayton found himself chuckling despite the precarious situation. "Ranch business is exactly what I'm supposed to be tending to. My father wants me to ride over to the Morrison place this afternoon to discuss purchasing their breeding bull." "Then why aren't you?" It was a fair question, and one Clayton had been avoiding asking himself. The honest answer was that he found the prospect of another business negotiation with neighbors he'd known all his life mind-numbingly predictable. Everything about his life these days felt predetermined. The conversations, the social obligations, the expectations that followed him like shadows. But watching Eleanor Sullivan build her future with nothing but determination and worn tools felt like witnessing something miraculous. "Maybe I wanted to see if you'd fallen off the roof yet," he said, aiming for lightness, but hearing something more serious creep into his voice. Eleanor stopped hammering and looked at him directly for the first time since he'd climbed the ladder. Her eyes were gray-green, like storm clouds over prairie grass, and they seemed to see right through whatever polite facades he might try to maintain. "You don't know anything about me, Mr. Hartwell. For all you know, I could be a dangerous criminal, fleeing justice, or a confidence woman looking for her next mark. Are you? Would I tell you if I were?" Clayton considered this seriously, studying her face for clues to the mystery she represented. Everything about Eleanor Sullivan suggested contradictions: the refined speech paired with calloused hands, the expensive hairpins holding back hair that hadn't seen a proper salon in months, the way she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority despite her current circumstances. "No," he said finally, "but I don't think you are either. A criminal would try harder to blend in, and a confidence woman wouldn't be building a cabin in the middle of nowhere." "Very logical." Eleanor resumed her work, positioning the next shingle with careful precision. "Though it occurs to me that you're making assumptions based on very little evidence. Sometimes you have to trust your instincts about people. And what do your instincts tell you about me?" The question hung between them like morning mist, fraught with implications Clayton wasn't prepared to examine. His instincts told him that Eleanor Sullivan was the most intriguing woman he'd ever encountered, that her fierce independence masked deep wounds he wanted to understand and heal, that the way she moved through her work with quiet competence made him question everything he thought he knew about feminine nature. His instincts also told him he was in danger of becoming far more involved in her situation than wisdom would dictate. "They tell me you're exactly what you appear to be," he said carefully. "A woman of considerable strength and determination who's chosen to build a new life in a hard place." Eleanor's hammer paused mid-swing. "And what do they tell you about why a woman might make such a choice?" The vulnerability beneath the question caught him off guard. For all her prickly independence, there was something almost fragile in the way she waited for his answer, as if his opinion mattered more than she wanted to admit. "They tell me it's none of my business unless you choose to make it so." Relief flickered across her features so quickly he almost missed it. "That's a refreshingly sensible attitude, Mr. Hartwell." "Clayton, if we're going to continue having conversations on rooftops, we might as well dispense with the formalities." "Are we going to continue having conversations on rooftops?" "That depends on whether you keep doing dangerous construction. Work without proper help." Eleanor sighed and set down her hammer, shifting carefully to face him more fully. The movement highlighted the growing curve of her belly, and Clayton felt his protective instincts surge again. "Clayton, I understand that my situation probably seems—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Unconventional. But I assure you, I'm not some helpless creature in need of rescuing. I chose this life deliberately, and I'm quite capable of managing the challenges that come with it. I don't doubt your capability. But being capable doesn't mean you have to face everything alone. Sometimes alone is safer." The words slipped out before she could stop them, revealing more than she'd intended. Clayton saw pain flash across her face. Old pain, the kind that left permanent marks on a person's soul. "Safer than what?" he asked gently. Eleanor's expression shuttered immediately, walls slamming back into place with almost audible force. "Safer than depending on other people's charity. Safer than owing favors I can't repay. Safer than disappointing expectations I never agreed to meet." Each word was delivered with crisp precision, as if she'd rehearsed this speech many times. Clayton recognized the defensive posture. He'd seen it in wild horses that had been mistreated, in ranch hands who'd learned that trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. What if someone offered help without expecting anything in return? There's always something expected in return. Always. Eleanor picked up her hammer again, the motion sharp with suppressed emotion. "Kindness has a price, Clayton. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's hidden, but there's always a bill that comes due eventually." "Who hurt you?" The question was out before Clayton could stop it, too direct and too personal for their fragile acquaintance. Eleanor's face went white, and for a moment he thought she might lose her grip on the hammer. "That," she said finally, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "is definitely none of your business." Clayton nodded, recognizing the boundary and respecting it even as every instinct urged him to push for answers. Whatever had driven Eleanor Sullivan to this isolated patch of Montana wilderness, it involved betrayal deep enough to make her distrust simple kindness. "You're right. I apologize for overstepping." Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, as if surprised by his willingness to back down. "Thank you." They worked in companionable silence for the next hour, Clayton holding shingles and passing nails, while Eleanor positioned and hammered with methodical efficiency. He found himself impressed by her skill. Her cuts were clean, her measurements precise, and she worked with the confidence of someone who understood both tools and timber. When they finally climbed down from the roof, the sun had climbed high enough to make the work uncomfortably warm. Eleanor pulled off her hat and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of sawdust across her brow that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her prickly independence suggested. "Thank you for the help," she said, the admission clearly costing her something. "I admit it went faster with an extra pair of hands." "You're welcome." "And Eleanor?" He paused until she looked at him directly. "For what it's worth, I think you're building something remarkable here. Not just the cabin, the whole enterprise. It takes rare courage to start over completely." Color rose in her cheeks, and for a moment the defensive walls dropped completely, revealing a woman who'd been carrying more weight than anyone should bear alone. Some people might call it foolishness rather than courage. "Some people are idiots." Eleanor laughed, a real laugh, bright and surprised. And Clayton felt something shift in his chest like a key, turning in a long, locked door. The sound transformed her entire face, revealing glimpses of the woman she might have been before whatever had happened to bring her here. "I should let you get to your ranch business," she said, but there was reluctance in her voice that matched his own. "The Morrison bull will still be there tomorrow." Clayton gathered his hat and gloves, stalling for time. "Eleanor, I meant what I said about offering help. Not out of pity or because I think you're helpless, but because, well, because neighbors should look out for each other. We're not exactly neighbors. Your ranch is 10 miles away. In Boston, 10 miles might as well be another country. Out here, it makes us practically family." Eleanor's expression grew wary at the word family, and Clayton cursed himself for the poor choice of words. Whatever her story was, it clearly involved people who should have protected her and hadn't. "I prefer to keep my family small," she said carefully. "Fair enough. But if you change your mind about accepting help from a friendly acquaintance, you know where to find me." Clayton mounted his horse and touched his hat brim in farewell, but as he rode away, he found himself already planning his next visit. The woman building a cabin alone in the wilderness had gotten under his skin in ways he didn't entirely understand, and despite every rational argument for staying away, he knew he'd be back. The silver watch in his vest pocket ticked steadily against his ribs, marking time toward a future he could no longer clearly envision. For the first time in his life, the path laid out before him, marriage to a suitable woman, children to carry on the family name, gradual assumption of his father's responsibilities, felt less like destiny and more like a cage. And somewhere in a clearing 10 miles south, a pregnant woman was building her own destiny with nothing but determination and an axe, refusing all offers of help while secretly breaking his heart with her fierce, lonely courage. The leather work gloves had belonged to Eleanor's father, and, even now, 3 years after his death, they still carried the faint scent of pipe tobacco and wood shavings that had defined her childhood. She pulled them on each morning like armor, the worn leather molding to her hands, as if James Sullivan himself was guiding her movements through another day of back-breaking labor. This morning, however, the gloves felt different, tighter across her knuckles, more restricting than protective. Everything felt different, actually. The baby had dropped lower in the past week, creating a new heaviness that made every task more challenging. Bending to pick up lumber sent shooting pains through her lower back, and climbing the ladder to work on the roof left her breathless in ways that had nothing to do with exertion. Eleanor stood in her clearing, surveying the cabin that was finally beginning to look like a home. The walls were complete, the roof shingled, and yesterday she'd hung the heavy wooden door she'd spent 3 days crafting by hand. Small windows flanked the entrance, their glass panes carefully transported from Willowbrook in a wagon she'd hired with her dwindling funds. Inside, the stone fireplace stood ready for winter, its chimney drawing perfectly after several adjustments that had left her covered in soot and cursing in ways her finishing school instructors would have found appalling. But today, she needed to tackle the most daunting task yet, splitting enough firewood to last through the brutal Montana winter. The pile of logs she'd cut and hauled from the forest seemed to mock her from across the clearing, a mountain of timber that would need to be transformed into manageable pieces before the first snow fell. She picked up the splitting maul, its weight familiar in her hands after weeks of practice. The first few logs split cleanly, the satisfying crack of wood giving way to steel echoing across the prairie. But as the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher, Eleanor found herself pausing more frequently to catch her breath and ease the growing ache in her back. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from her work, and she wasn't entirely surprised to see Clayton Hartwell riding into her clearing. His visits had become a regular occurrence over the past 2 weeks, always timed to coincide with her most challenging tasks, and always accompanied by polite offers of assistance that she consistently declined. What did surprise her was the way her heart seemed to lift slightly at the sight of him, despite her best efforts to maintain emotional distance. "Morning, Eleanor," he called out, dismounting with his usual fluid grace. "Splitting firewood, I see. That's hard work, even for a man," she finished dryly. "Yes, you've mentioned that observation before." Clayton grinned, apparently, unbothered by her sharp tone. "I was going to say even for someone with proper help, but your version works too." Eleanor set down the maul and wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, acutely aware of how she must look, hair escaping from its braid, work dress damp with perspiration, face flushed with exertion. A few months ago, the thought of any gentleman seeing her in such a state would have mortified her. Now she found she cared less about appearances and more about the way Clayton's eyes seemed to assess her with something that looked suspiciously like admiration. "Let me guess," she said. "You were just riding by and thought you'd check on the poor helpless woman. Actually, I brought you something." Clayton reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "My mother insisted I deliver it personally." Eleanor eyed the package suspiciously. "Your mother doesn't even know me. She knows you're a pregnant woman living alone, and that's enough for Catherine Hartwell to consider you her personal responsibility." Clayton held out the bundle. "She sent knitted baby clothes and some of her special tea blend for morning sickness. She also wanted me to invite you to Sunday dinner, though I told her you'd probably decline." The casual mention of his family's awareness of her situation sent a chill through Eleanor, despite the warm morning air. She'd worked so hard to remain invisible, to avoid the kind of attention that led to questions and judgments and well-meaning interference. "You told your family about me?" Something in her voice made Clayton's expression grow more serious. Only that a neighbor was homesteading alone and might appreciate some friendly support. "My mother has a soft heart for women in difficult circumstances, and—" "What did you tell them about my circumstances?" "Nothing, because I don't know anything about your circumstances, only what I can see with my own eyes." Eleanor studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda, but found only the honest concern she'd come to recognize in their previous encounters. Still, the thought of being discussed by strangers, even well-meaning ones, made her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. "I appreciate the gesture, but I don't need charity. It's not charity, it's neighborliness. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because in my experience, people rarely offer help without expecting something." In return, Clayton was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face. "What happened to you, Eleanor? What made you so afraid of simple kindness?" The question hit too close to home, stirring up memories she'd worked hard to bury. Charles's honeyed words during their courtship, promising eternal devotion while already carrying on with his secretary. Her father's business partner, who'd offered to help manage her inheritance after James Sullivan's death, only to discover he'd been embezzling funds for months. Even her own mother, whose version of support had come with conditions and expectations that felt more like chains than comfort. "I'm not afraid," she said finally. "I'm practical. I've learned that independence is safer than obligation. And lonelier. Loneliness is a small price to pay for peace of mind." Clayton shook his head, his expression mixing frustration with something that looked almost like grief. "That's not living, Eleanor. That's just surviving. Survival is all I need right now. What about after the baby comes? What about when winter sets in and you're snowed in for weeks at a time? What about when something goes wrong and there's no one around to help?" Each question hit like a physical blow, exposing fears she'd been trying not to acknowledge. Eleanor had planned for the practical aspects of winter: food stores, firewood, warm clothing. But the emotional reality of spending months alone with a newborn in an isolated cabin was something she'd deliberately avoided contemplating. "I'll manage," she said, the words sounding hollow even to her own ears. "You don't have to manage alone." The gentleness in his voice nearly undid her careful composure. Eleanor turned away, ostensibly to examine the pile of unsplit logs, but really to hide the sudden moisture in her eyes. "What are you suggesting, Clayton? That I become your family's charity case? That I accept help I can never repay and spend the rest of my life feeling beholden to people who owe me nothing? I'm suggesting that maybe you could trust someone again, that maybe not everyone who offers help has ulterior motives, and maybe some of us have learned that trust is a luxury we can't afford." The words came out harder than she'd intended, but Eleanor couldn't seem to soften the edges of her voice. Every instinct screamed at her to maintain distance, to keep the walls firmly in place that had protected her through the worst period of her life. But when she risked a glance at Clayton's face, she saw something that made her chest tighten with an emotion she'd thought permanently buried. He was looking at her with the kind of understanding that came from recognizing shared pain, as if he knew exactly what it cost her to push away every offered hand. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I'm not asking you to trust me with your secrets or your future. I'm just asking you to let me help split some firewood." The simple request, delivered without pressure or expectation, somehow broke through her defenses more effectively than any argument or persuasion could have. Eleanor found herself nodding before she could think better of it. "All right, but just the firewood." Clayton's smile was like sunrise after a long night. Just the firewood. They worked together in comfortable silence, establishing a rhythm that doubled Eleanor's productivity while cutting her effort in half. Clayton wielded the heavy maul with practiced ease while she stacked the split pieces, and Eleanor found herself grudgingly impressed by his skill. Clearly, the wealthy rancher's son had done his share of physical labor despite his privileged upbringing. "You're better at this than I expected," she admitted during a water break. "Did you think I spent all my time sipping brandy in the parlor?" "Something like that." Clayton laughed, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. "My father believes in the dignity of hard work. Every Hartwell man learns the ranch from the ground up, mucking stalls, mending fences, birthing calves. He says you can't properly manage what you don't understand. Sounds like a wise man. He is. Also stubborn, opinionated, and convinced he knows what's best for everyone in a 50-mile radius." Something in Clayton's tone suggested this last trait was currently causing him personal difficulty. Eleanor found herself curious, despite her determination to avoid entanglement in his problems. "Let me guess, he has opinions about your future. He has my entire life mapped out like a military campaign. Marriage to Victoria Morrison by next spring, taking over the breeding program, producing the next generation of Hartwell heirs right. On schedule. The mention of marriage plans shouldn't have affected Eleanor at all, but she felt an unexpected stab of something that might have been disappointment. Which was ridiculous, since she had no claim on Clayton Hartwell's affections and no desire to complicate her life with romantic entanglements. Victoria Morrison sounds like a suitable choice, she said carefully. I assume she's from a good family? The best. Her father owns the largest spread in the county. She was educated at the finest schools back east, and she has all the accomplishments expected of a rancher's wife. She can organize a dinner party for 20, play piano with remarkable skill, and discuss literature with impressive erudition. But Clayton paused in his wood-splitting, leaning on the maul handle. But she's never split a piece of firewood in her life. Never mucked a stall or delivered a calf, or stayed up all night nursing a sick animal. She sees the ranch as a business enterprise rather than a way of life. There's nothing wrong with approaching ranching as a business. No, there isn't. But there's something wrong with marrying someone because they fit a predetermined ideal, rather than because you can't imagine living without them. The words hung between them like a challenge, loaded with implications that made Eleanor's pulse quicken despite her best intentions. She busied herself with stacking wood, using the repetitive motion to calm her suddenly racing thoughts. Marriage, based on practical considerations, often works out well, she said finally. Love is unpredictable, unreliable, spoken like someone who's been hurt by it. Eleanor's hands stilled on the firewood, spoken like someone who's learned the difference between romantic fantasy and reality. What if they don't have to be mutually exclusive? Then you're more optimistic than I am. Clayton resumed his splitting, each strike of the maul driven with more force than strictly necessary. Maybe, or maybe I just haven't given up hope that there's something better than settling for what's expected. They finished the woodpile in relative silence, both lost in thoughts too complex for casual conversation. When the last log was split and stacked, Eleanor surveyed their work with satisfaction. The neat rows of firewood represented security, preparation for the challenges ahead. She'd made it through another day, completed another essential task, moved one step closer to true independence. So why did the prospect of Clayton riding away leave her feeling more alone than she had in weeks? Thank you, she said, the words coming easier than she'd expected. I couldn't have finished this today without your help. You would have managed. It just would have taken longer and cost you more in terms of exhaustion. Still, I appreciate it. Clayton nodded, gathering his hat and gloves. As he prepared to mount his horse, he turned back to her with an expression of careful neutrality. Eleanor, the offer for Sunday dinner stands. My mother would be genuinely pleased to meet you, and you'd be welcome at our table any time. Eleanor felt the familiar flutter of panic at the thought of social obligations and expectations. I don't think that would be wise. Why not? Because? She struggled to articulate fears that seemed both overwhelming and ridiculous when examined directly. Because I'm not sure I remember how to be around people anymore. Because I don't want to answer questions about my past or my plans. Because once people know me, they start having opinions about what I should do differently. And because you're afraid you might like us? The gentle accuracy of his observation made her chest tight. Maybe. Clayton mounted his horse but didn't. Immediately gather the reins. For what it's worth, I think you'd fit in better than you imagine. My mother has strong opinions about a lot of things, but she also has a gift for accepting people exactly as they are. I'll think about it. It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Clayton seemed content to accept the polite fiction. He touched his hat brim in farewell and rode away, leaving Eleanor standing beside her neatly stacked firewood with her father's gloves still protecting her hands, and her heart beating just a little faster than it should have been. That night, as she sat beside her new fireplace with the baby moving restlessly beneath her ribs, Eleanor unwrapped the package Clayton had brought from his mother. Inside were tiny knitted garments in soft yellow wool, practical items that spoke of skill and care rather than showiness. A small note was tucked between the baby clothes, written in a neat feminine hand. "Dear Miss Sullivan, please know that you have friends nearby, even if we haven't met yet. These were knitted with hope for your child's health and happiness. The tea is an old family recipe that helped me through 4 pregnancies. Steep it strong and add honey to taste. With warm wishes, Catherine Hartwell." Eleanor held the soft baby, close against her cheek, feeling tears threaten for the first time in weeks. Such simple kindness, offered without conditions or expectations. Maybe Clayton was right. Maybe not everyone who offered help had ulterior motives. But as she carefully rewrapped the gifts and tucked them away, Eleanor reminded herself that wanting to believe in unconditional kindness and actually trusting it were 2 very different things. She'd learned that lesson too painfully to forget it now, no matter how much her lonely heart might wish otherwise. The quilt squares spread across Eleanor's kitchen table told a story of hope, measured in careful stitches. Each piece of fabric had been salvaged from worn-out clothing, the blue from her father's favorite work shirt, the cream from a dress she'd never wear again, the soft brown from a shawl that had belonged to her grandmother. Together, they would become a blanket for the baby, something warm and beautiful, created from remnants of a life she'd left behind. Eleanor ran her fingers over the partially completed border, admiring the tiny, even stitches that represented hours of work by lamplight. Quilting had been one of the few domestic arts she genuinely enjoyed during her privileged youth, finding peace in the rhythmic motion of needle through fabric. Now, with winter approaching and long evenings stretching ahead, the project gave her hands something to do, while her mind wrestled with thoughts she couldn't quite banish. Thoughts that increasingly involved a certain dark-haired rancher who seemed determined to breach every defense she'd carefully constructed. The baby shifted restlessly, responding to her agitation with a series of sharp kicks that made her gasp and press a hand to her ribs. 6 months along now, and her condition was becoming impossible to disguise beneath loose clothing. Soon, she'd need to make decisions about practical matters like finding a midwife and preparing for the birth itself. The isolation that had seemed like blessed peace during her first weeks in Montana now felt more precarious. What if something went wrong during delivery? What if the baby came early, during a blizzard when no help could reach her? What if she died in childbirth and left her child orphaned in a cabin miles from civilization? Eleanor shook her head firmly, banishing such morbid thoughts. Women had been giving birth without medical assistance for thousands of years. She was strong, healthy, and determined. That would have to be enough. A knock at her door made her look up from the quilt squares with surprise. It was late afternoon, an unusual time for visitors, and she wasn't expecting anyone. Clayton's visits had become more frequent but followed a predictable pattern, morning check-ins that coincided with her most challenging tasks. She opened the door to find a woman, perhaps 10 years her senior, with graying brown hair and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The visitor's clothing marked her as someone of means. Well-made wool dress, quality leather boots, a warm cloak that spoke of careful craftsmanship rather than hurried necessity. "Miss Sullivan, I'm Catherine Hartwell. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I was visiting the Kowalskis and thought I'd stop by to introduce myself properly." Eleanor's first instinct was to politely decline the visit and retreat back into her protective solitude. But something in Catherine Hartwell's expression, a mixture of genuine warmth and careful respect, made her hesitate. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is unexpected." "I'm sure it is. Clayton mentioned you prefer your privacy, but I wanted to thank you personally for the letter you sent with the tea." Eleanor frowned, confused. "I didn't send any letter." Catherine's smile grew warmer. "Perhaps not in words, but the fact that you kept the baby clothes and used the tea blend told me everything I needed to know. A woman who truly wanted no contact would have returned the gifts unopened." The gentle astuteness of the observation caught Eleanor off guard. She found herself stepping back to allow Clayton's mother entry, though she couldn't quite say why. "Please, come in. I was just working on some sewing." Catherine entered with the confident grace of someone accustomed to being welcomed wherever she went. But her eyes held none of the calculating assessment Eleanor had learned to expect from society women. Instead, she seemed genuinely interested. In the cabin's simple appointments, the stone fireplace, the hand-hewn furniture, the neat efficiency of the small space. "What a lovely home you've created," Catherine said, and the admiration in her voice sounded entirely sincere. "Clayton told me you built it yourself, but I had to see it to believe it. The craftsmanship is remarkable." "Thank you. It's not fancy, but it serves my needs. Fancy is overrated. Comfortable and well-built matter more." Catherine's gaze fell on the quilt squares scattered across the table. "Oh, what beautiful work! May I?" Eleanor nodded, watching nervously as Catherine examined the pieces with the eye of someone who understood fine needlework. She'd learned to be wary of other women's judgments, particularly those from a different social class who might see her current circumstances as either pitiable or scandalous. "The stitching is exquisite," Catherine said softly, "and the way you've combined these fabrics, there's real artistry here. This will be a treasured heirloom. It's just something to keep my hands busy." "It's much more than that." Catherine's tone grew gentle. "It's a love letter to your child, written in thread and fabric. Every mother understands that language." The simple acknowledgement of her maternal feelings, spoken without judgment or question, brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. For months, she'd carried the weight of impending motherhood alone, with no one to share her fears or excitement, or the 100 small concerns that occupied her thoughts. "Would you like some tea?" Eleanor asked, needing to busy her hands before emotion overwhelmed her completely. "That would be lovely." As Eleanor prepared the tea, using Catherine's own blend, which had indeed helped with her morning sickness, she found herself stealing glances at her visitor. Clayton's mother seemed utterly at ease in the humble cabin, neither condescending about its simplicity nor overly effusive in her praise. She radiated the kind of calm confidence that came from genuine security rather than social posturing. "How long have you lived in Montana?" Eleanor asked as she poured the steaming tea into her 2 good cups. 28 years. I came as a bride. From Chicago, certain I was making the worst mistake of my life." Catherine chuckled at the memory. The ranch was barely more than a dream then. A few hundred head of cattle, a 1-room cabin that leaked when it rained, and a husband who worked 18-hour days just to keep us fed. "That must have been difficult." "Terrifying," Catherine corrected cheerfully. "I'd been raised to manage servants and plan dinner parties, not cook over an open fire or help deliver calves. The first winter, I cried myself to sleep most nights, convinced I'd married beneath my station and ruined my life." Eleanor sat down across from her guest, cradling her teacup for warmth. "What changed?" "I did. Slowly, gradually, I learned that there was more satisfaction in building something real than in maintaining something artificial. The ranch became our shared creation rather than just my husband's obsession. And the land," Catherine gazed out the window toward the mountains. "The land gets into your blood eventually, makes you understand what freedom really means. And you never regretted leaving Chicago." "Oh, I had moments. Usually during blizzards or when one of the children was sick and the nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away. But regret, no. This life gave me purpose I never could have found in a city parlor." Eleanor sipped her tea, absorbing the implications of Catherine's story. Here was a woman who'd made the same choice Eleanor was making, trading security and social approval for independence and authenticity. The difference was that Catherine had made the journey with a partner, while Eleanor faced hers alone. "Clayton mentioned you were educated back east," Catherine continued. "Boston, I believe." Eleanor tensed, prepared for the inevitable questions about her family and circumstances. "Yes, though that seems like a lifetime ago now." "I'm sure it does." Leaving everything familiar behind requires tremendous courage, especially under, Catherine paused delicately, challenging circumstances. You mean being pregnant and unmarried? I mean being alone when you clearly weren't meant to be. The gentle reframe surprised Eleanor. She'd grown so accustomed to shame and judgment that simple acceptance felt almost foreign. People have opinions about women in my situation. People have opinions about everything. The question is whether you're going to let their opinions determine how you live your life. Easy to say when you have the protection of respectability. Catherine set down her teacup and studied Eleanor with eyes that seemed to see straight through every defensive wall she'd constructed. My dear, I've been married for 28 years to a man who believes women should be protected and cherished. I have 4 healthy children, own one of the most successful ranches in Montana, and hold a position of respect in my community. And I'm telling you that what you're doing, building a life for yourself and your child through pure determination, requires more courage than anything I've ever attempted. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they offered the kind of validation she'd been desperately craving without daring to ask for it. I don't feel courageous. Most days I feel terrified and overwhelmed, and certain I'm making terrible mistakes. That's what courage is, moving forward despite the fear. Anyone can be brave when they're not afraid. Eleanor found herself blinking. Back tears for the second time since Catherine's arrival. Why are you being so kind to me? You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you've faced something difficult enough to make you leave everything familiar behind. I know you're building a home with your own hands and preparing to raise a child alone. I know my son comes home from his visits here with an expression I haven't seen since he was a boy, watching wild horses run free. Catherine's smile grew knowing. And I know that combination of strength and vulnerability when I see it because I wore it myself once. Clayton has been helpful, but I don't want you to think there's anything improper between us. Improper? Catherine laughed, a warm sound that filled the small cabin. My dear girl, there's nothing improper about 2 people recognizing something worthwhile in each other. The only impropriety would be pretending otherwise out of misguided propriety. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm not looking for romantic complications. My focus has to be on survival and preparing for the baby. Of course it does, but that doesn't mean you have to face everything alone. And it doesn't mean you have to close your heart to possibilities just because you've been hurt before. The casual reference to past pain made Eleanor stiffen. Clayton told you about my circumstances? Clayton told me nothing beyond the fact that you're homesteading alone. But it doesn't take much insight to recognize that a woman doesn't end up in your situation without experiencing betrayal deep enough to make her distrust simple kindness. Eleanor stared into her teacup, struggling with the urge to confess everything to this woman, who seemed to offer understanding without judgment. But the habits of secrecy and self-protection were too deeply ingrained. Some betrayals leave permanent scars, she said finally. They do. But scars are proof that wounds can heal, even if they leave marks behind. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the afternoon light slant through the cabin's small windows. Eleanor found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't since arriving in Montana, as if Catherine's presence had temporarily lifted some of the weight she'd been carrying alone. Mrs. Hartwell, may I ask you something? Catherine, please. And of course, when you first came to Montana, did you ever doubt that you'd made the right choice? Even after you'd adjusted to the life here? Catherine considered the question seriously. Every woman doubts her choices sometimes, especially the big ones. But I learned to distinguish between doubts born of fear and doubts born of genuine wisdom. Fear tells you to retreat to safety even when safety isn't really safe. Wisdom tells you to examine your motivations and adjust course when necessary. And how do you tell the difference? Fear makes you smaller. Wisdom helps you grow. Eleanor pondered this, thinking about her own motivations for coming to Montana. Had she been running towards something or away from it? Was her fierce independence born of strength or fear? "I should let you get back to your evening," Catherine said eventually, though she seemed reluctant to end the visit. "But before I go, I want you to know that you have friends here, whether or not you choose to acknowledge them. And if you ever need anything, medical help, supplies, or just someone to talk to, you only have to ask." "Thank you. That means more than you know." Catherine rose to leave, then paused at the door. "Eleanor, may I give you one piece of unsolicited advice?" Eleanor nodded, though every instinct urged caution. "Don't let past hurt keep you from recognizing present possibilities. The people who failed you before don't get to determine whether you'll accept love when it's offered honestly." Before Eleanor could respond, Catherine was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of her perfume and words that seemed to echo in the sudden quiet of the cabin. That evening, as Eleanor returned to her quilting by lamplight, she found herself thinking about the conversation in ways that both comforted and unsettled her. Clayton Hartwell had offered the kind of maternal warmth and wisdom Eleanor hadn't realized she'd been craving. But she'd also challenged assumptions Eleanor had built her entire new life around. Was it possible that her determination to remain independent was actually limiting her rather than protecting her? Could accepting help and friendship make her stronger rather than more vulnerable? The baby stirred beneath her ribs, reminding her that soon her choices would affect more than just herself. Did she want to raise her child in complete isolation? Or could she find a way to build community without sacrificing autonomy? As she worked another careful stitch into the growing quilt, Eleanor found herself thinking about Clayton's visits with new awareness. She'd been so focused on maintaining emotional distance that she'd failed to recognize what was actually developing between them. Not the predatory interest she'd learned to fear, but something more honest and infinitely more dangerous. The realization that she was falling in love with Clayton Hartwell hit her with the force of a physical blow, and the knowledge that such feelings could only lead to heartbreak for both of them made her hands shake as she set aside her needlework and prepared for another sleepless night. The bent horseshoe had been rusting in the grass behind Eleanor's cabin for weeks before she noticed it, half buried beneath fallen leaves and forgotten by whatever horse had cast it. Most people would have seen nothing but scrap metal, but Eleanor saw possibility. After an afternoon of heating and reshaping it over her forge, a simple setup she'd built from river stones and determination, the horseshoe had become a door. Handle, its curves polished smooth and warm to the touch. It was a fitting metaphor for transformation, she thought, as she admired her handiwork. Something broken and discarded, made beautiful and useful again through patience and skill. If only human hearts could be reshaped so easily. The November wind carried the bite of approaching winter as Eleanor stood on her porch, watching storm clouds gather over the mountains. In Boston, November had meant the beginning of the social season, balls and dinner parties and elaborate rituals designed to showcase wealth and status. Here, it meant survival preparations and the sobering knowledge that she would soon be completely cut off from the outside world for months at a time. Her food stores were adequate, her firewood supply impressive, and the cabin was as weatherproof as her skills could make it. But as she watched the sky darken with the promise of snow, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was preparing for more than just winter weather. The sound of hoofbeats broke through her brooding, and she turned to see Clayton approaching, at a gallop rather than his usual easy lope. Something in his posture, tense, urgent, made her heart rate quicken with alarm. He reined in his horse with more force than necessary, swinging down from the saddle before the animal had come to a complete stop. His face was flushed with cold and something that looked like barely controlled anger. "Eleanor, thank God you're all right. When I saw the smoke, I thought—" He stopped abruptly, his gaze taking in her obviously unharmed state. "The smoke from your chimney looked wrong from a distance, heavier than usual. I was banking the fire for the night," she said, studying his agitated expression with growing concern. "Clayton, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. Not a ghost. A father. Clayton's mouth twisted with bitter humor, though sometimes I wonder if there's a difference. Eleanor had never heard him speak of his family with anything but respectful affection, and the change in his tone sent warning bells through her mind. Did something happen at the ranch? You could say that. Clayton began pacing the small porch. With restless energy, his movements sharp with suppressed emotion. My father received an interesting visitor today. Victoria Morrison's father, come to discuss wedding plans for next spring. The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. She'd known about Clayton's expected engagement, had even told herself it was for the best. But hearing it stated so bluntly made her chest tight with emotions she had no right to feel. That's good news, isn't it? You've known this was expected. Clayton stopped pacing and looked at her directly, his dark eyes blazing with frustration. Expected, yes, but I never agreed to it. And apparently my opinion on the matter is considered irrelevant. Surely your father wouldn't force you into marriage against your will, wouldn't he? Clayton's laugh held no humor. He's already promised Morrison that the engagement will be announced at Christmas. The wedding is planned for April, right after spring roundup. My future has been decided. Without my consultation, like I'm a prize bull being put out to stud. Eleanor sank into the wooden chair she'd built for the porch, suddenly needing the support. What did you tell him? That I wasn't ready for marriage, that I had responsibilities here that needed my attention first. Clayton's gaze found hers, and held it. He asked what responsibilities could possibly be more important than securing the family's future. I told him I'd made commitments to help a neighbor through the winter. Clayton, you can't use me as an excuse to delay your engagement. That's not fair to anyone involved. I'm not using you as an excuse. I'm telling the truth. He moved closer, his expression growing more intense. Eleanor, these past months, coming here, talking with you, watching you build something real with your own hands, it's shown me what's been missing from my life. And what's that? Purpose, meaning, the feeling that what I'm doing matters beyond meeting someone else's expectations. Eleanor's heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears, but she forced herself to think rationally. Those feelings will pass. Marriage and family provide their own purpose and meaning. Victoria Morrison sounds like she'd make you a good wife. A suitable wife, Clayton corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Most successful marriages are built on compatibility and shared goals rather than romantic passion. Is that what you had? Compatibility and shared goals? The question came without warning, cutting through her defenses before she could raise them. Eleanor felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever her past threatened to surface. Thought I did, she said carefully. I was wrong about many things. What happened, Eleanor? What made you so afraid of love that you'd choose isolation over the risk of being hurt again? The gentle persistence in his voice nearly broke her resolve to keep her secrets. But she'd learned that truth was a luxury she couldn't afford, especially not with a man who represented everything she'd tried to escape. My past isn't relevant to your situation. You have an opportunity for a good life with a woman from your own world. Don't throw that away because of some romantic notion about what we might have together. What we might have? Clayton's voice grew soft, dangerous. Eleanor, what do you think has been happening between us these past months? I think a kind. Man has been helping a neighbor in need. Nothing more. Nothing more. Clayton repeated the words like they tasted bitter. Is that really what you believe? Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze steadily, though it felt like looking into the sun. It's what I have to believe. Why? Because anything else would be foolish and destructive for both of us. Clayton was quiet for a long moment, studying, her face with an intensity that made her want to retreat into the cabin. When he spoke again, his voice held a note of understanding that frightened her more than anger would have. Someone really did a number on you, didn't they? Someone made you believe that caring about anyone is dangerous. Someone taught me that feelings and reality are often incompatible. And what if they're not? What if there's a way for us to be together without sacrificing everything we've worked for? There isn't. Eleanor stood abruptly, needing distance from the hope in his voice. Clayton, you're a rancher's son with responsibilities to your family and community. I'm a pregnant woman with no social standing and a past I can't escape. There's no scenario where those two realities can coexist happily. What if I don't care about social standing? Then you're more naive than I thought. The words came out harsher than she'd intended, designed to wound and create distance. Clayton flinched as if she'd struck him, and Eleanor felt immediate regret for her cruelty. I'm sorry, she said quickly. That was unfair. You're not naive, you're idealistic. But idealism doesn't survive contact with harsh reality. Is that what you think this is? Idealism? I think you're romanticizing a situation that has no good endings. Your father is right to push for the Morrison marriage. It makes sense for your life and your future. And what about your life? What about your future? My future is building a life for my child and myself. Alone. It doesn't have to be alone. The quiet certainty in his voice made her chest ache with longing she couldn't afford to acknowledge. How easy it would be to believe him. To let herself imagine a world where love conquered practical obstacles and social conventions. But she'd believed in fairy tales once before, and the ending had nearly destroyed her. Yes, it does, she said, firmly. And you need to accept that, Clayton, for both our sakes. I can't accept it, not when I know you feel something for me too. What I feel doesn't matter. It's the only thing that matters. Eleanor turned away from him, gripping the porch railing with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain calm. Please go home, Clayton. Marry Victoria Morrison and build the life your family expects. Forget about me. Is that what you really want? No, her heart screamed. What she wanted was to throw caution to the wind and trust that love could overcome any obstacle. What she wanted was to believe that Clayton's feelings were genuine and lasting rather than temporary infatuation. What she wanted was to stop being afraid of her own emotions, but what she wanted and what was wise were two different things entirely. It's what needs to happen, she said instead. Clayton was quiet for so long that she finally turned to look at him. His expression had shifted from frustrated passion to something that looked almost like defeat. You know what the truly heartbreaking part is, he said finally. I think I could have changed your mind given enough time. I think underneath all that armor you've built, there's a woman who wants to love and be loved just as much as I do, Clayton. But I can see now that you're not going to give me that time. You're so terrified of being hurt again that you'd rather hurt both of us first, just to maintain control. The accuracy of his assessment hit her like a slap. Eleanor felt exposed, vulnerable, as if he'd stripped away every defense she'd carefully constructed. That's not fair, isn't it? You've decided that everyone who offers love is lying or temporary or will eventually leave, so you're getting your rejection in first. It's self-protection disguised as wisdom. And what if you're wrong? What if trusting you would be the biggest mistake of my life? Then at least you'd have lived fully enough to make a mistake worth regretting. Clayton mounted his horse in one fluid motion, but instead of riding away immediately, he looked down at her with an expression that mixed sadness with something that might have been pity. Eleanor, I hope someday you find the courage to let someone love you properly. You deserve that, even if you don't believe it. And I hope you find happiness with Victoria Morrison, she replied, though the words felt like glass in her throat. No, you don't. If you did, you wouldn't look like your heart was breaking when you said it. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Clayton was gone, disappearing into the gathering dusk with the sound of hoofbeats fading into silence. She stood on her porch long after he'd vanished, watching the first snowflakes of winter begin to fall and feeling as though something precious had been lost forever. Inside the cabin, the transformed horseshoe caught the firelight as she passed, its polished surface gleaming with promise. But some things Eleanor reminded herself, were too broken to be reshaped into something beautiful. Some damage was permanent, no matter how much heat and pressure you applied. The baby stirred restlessly beneath her ribs, responding to her emotional turmoil with increased movement. Eleanor placed both hands on her belly, trying to offer comfort she didn't feel. "It's just you and me," she whispered to her unborn child. "Just like it was always meant to be." But even as she said the words, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. The baby cradle had taken Eleanor 3 weeks to complete, each curve and joint crafted with the kind of meticulous care that came from having nothing but time and an overwhelming need to create something beautiful for the child she carried. Made from golden pine, she'd selected herself from the forest. It rocked with gentle grace on curved runners that reminded her of her father's old rocking chair back in Boston. Now, as December snow fell steadily outside her cabin windows, Eleanor ran her hands over the smooth wood and tried to imagine a future beyond the next few months. The cradle represented hope and preparation, but it also highlighted the growing reality of her situation. Soon she would be responsible for a completely helpless human being, and she would face that responsibility entirely alone. The isolation that had once felt like blessed freedom now pressed against her like a physical weight. 3 weeks had passed since Clayton's last visit, 3 weeks since their painful confrontation on the porch. She told herself his absence was for the best, that cutting ties cleanly was better than prolonging an impossible situation. But the silence felt heavier than the snow accumulating outside her door. Eleanor settled into her chair by the fire, picking up the baby quilt she'd nearly finished. The yellow squares glowed warm in the firelight, each stitch a meditation on the future she was trying to build. But tonight her fingers felt clumsy and her concentration scattered. Every sound outside made her look up hopefully, then slump back in disappointment when it proved to be only wind or settling snow. A sharp knock at her door made her drop the quilt entirely. Visitors were rare enough in good weather. In the middle of a snowstorm, they were practically unheard of. Eleanor struggled to her feet, her advanced pregnancy making every movement more awkward, and opened the door to find Johann Kowalski standing on her porch, his beard crusted with ice and his expression grim. "Johann, what are you doing out in this weather?" "Miss Sullivan, forgive the intrusion. May I come in? I have news you need to hear." Something in his tone made Eleanor's stomach clench with dread, but she stepped aside to let him enter. Johann stamped the snow from his boots and removed his hat, revealing hair matted with sweat despite the freezing temperature. "Has something happened to Maria? The children?" No, my family as well. But there is talk in town, Miss Sullivan. Talk that concerns you and the Hartwell boy." Eleanor's blood seemed to freeze in her veins. "What kind of talk?" Johann's weathered face creased with discomfort. "People are saying things. That you and young Clayton have been improper, that his frequent visits here are causing scandal. That's ridiculous. Mr. Hartwell has been neighborly, nothing more. I know this and you know this. But gossip does not require truth to spread, especially when it involves a woman in your circumstances and a wealthy man promised to another." Eleanor sank back into her chair, feeling as though the floor had shifted beneath her feet. She'd been so focused on protecting her emotional walls that she'd failed to consider how their friendship might appear to outside observers. What exactly are people saying? That Clayton Hartwell has been compromising his engagement by carrying on with a fallen woman, that he refuses to marry Victoria Morrison because he is besotted with you, that his father is beside himself with rage and threatens to disown him if the association continues. Each word hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She'd known their friendship was dangerous, but she'd underestimated how quickly and thoroughly it could destroy Clayton's reputation and future. "Johann, you have to understand. Nothing improper has happened between us. Mr. Hartwell has been kind enough to help with heavy work, but that's all. I believe you, Miss Sullivan, but belief and appearance are different things." And in a small community like ours, appearance often matters more than truth. Eleanor pressed her hands to her face, trying to think through the implications. If the gossip had reached the Kowalskis 6 miles away, it had certainly reached the Hartwell family. And Victoria Morrison's. Clayton's reputation was being destroyed because of his association with her, exactly the kind of consequence she'd feared but failed to prevent. "What should I do?" "Nothing," Johann said firmly. "You have done nothing wrong, and you should not be made to suffer for other people's small minds. But I thought you should know, so you can be prepared if anyone comes to you with accusations or demands." After Johann left, Eleanor sat by her fire and tried to process the magnitude of the situation. Her worst fears were coming true. Her presence in Clayton's life was damaging him in ways that couldn't be repaired. No matter how careful they'd been to maintain propriety, the simple fact of his visits had been enough to create scandal. She was still brooding over the problem when another knock came at her door. This time, she opened it to find Victoria Morrison standing on her porch, elegant even in traveling clothes and radiating controlled fury. "Miss Sullivan, I believe we need to talk." Eleanor had never met Victoria, but the woman's identity was unmistakable. Blonde, beautiful and perfectly dressed despite the harsh weather, she looked exactly like the sort of refined lady Clayton was expected to marry. Standing next to her, Eleanor felt acutely aware of her own appearance. Work dress stretched, tight over her pregnant belly, hair escaping from its braid, hands permanently stained from wood and forge work. "Miss Morrison, this is unexpected." "I'm sure it is. May I come in?" Eleanor wanted to refuse, to avoid the confrontation that was clearly coming, but basic courtesy demanded she offer shelter from the storm. She stepped aside reluctantly, watching as Victoria entered and surveyed the cabin's humble interior with eyes that missed nothing. "You've built quite a little nest here," Victoria said, her tone carefully neutral. "Very rustic, it serves my needs. I'm sure it does. And apparently it serves Clayton's needs as well, given how much time he spends here." The accusation hung between them like a drawn sword. Eleanor straightened to her full height, drawing on reserves of dignity she'd thought exhausted. "Mr. Hartwell has been kind enough to assist with heavy labor that I cannot manage alone." "Nothing more. Nothing more." Victoria's laugh was sharp, humorless. "Miss Sullivan, do you take me for a fool? Clayton has been so distracted these past months that he barely acknowledges my presence. He refuses to discuss wedding plans, avoids social gatherings, and rides out every morning in this direction. And I'm supposed to believe it's because of your heavy labor needs. I don't know what you're supposed to believe, Miss Morrison. I only know what's true. The truth is that you've bewitched him somehow, made him forget his duties and obligations, to chase after some romantic fantasy about rescuing a fallen woman." The casual cruelty of the phrase "fallen woman" hit Eleanor like a slap, but she refused to let Victoria see her flinch. "I've neither bewitched anyone nor requested rescue. I've made it clear to Mr. Hartwell that I prefer to handle my affairs independently." "Have you? Because from where I stand, it looks like you've been encouraging his infatuation while maintaining plausible deniability." "That's not true, isn't it? A lonely pregnant woman, all vulnerability and independence, the perfect combination to appeal to a man's protective instincts and romantic notions." Very clever, really. Eleanor felt anger rise in her chest, hot and fierce. "Miss Morrison, you don't know anything about me or my circumstances. I came to Montana to build a life for myself and my child, not to interfere in anyone else's relationships. And yet here we are, discussing how to salvage my engagement from the wreckage of your independence. If your engagement is in trouble, perhaps you should examine your relationship with Mr. Hartwell rather than blaming outside influences." Victoria's eyes flashed dangerously. "My relationship with Clayton is perfectly fine, thank you. We've been friends since childhood. Our families have planned this marriage for years, and we're ideally suited to each other. The only problem is your continued presence in his life. I'm not in his life. I haven't seen Mr. Hartwell in weeks, because His father finally put his foot down and forbade further contact. But Clayton is still pining after you like a lovesick schoolboy, and frankly, it's becoming embarrassing for everyone involved. Eleanor sat down heavily, the emotional weight of the conversation combining with her physical discomfort to leave, her feeling drained. "What do you want from me, Miss Morrison?" "I want you to disappear." The blunt demand caught Eleanor off guard. "Excuse me?" "Leave Montana, go back east, or go somewhere else entirely. I don't care where, as long as you're far enough away that Clayton can forget about you and focus on his real life." "This is my real life. I've built a home here, prepared for the birth of my child. You've built a shack in the wilderness and convinced yourself it's a home. That's not the same thing." Eleanor felt tears threaten, but refused to let them fall. In front of this woman, who clearly saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to be removed. "Miss Morrison, I understand you're upset about the gossip, but I can't simply abandon everything I've worked for because it inconveniences your wedding plans. Can't you? Because I think you'll find that life in this community could become very difficult for someone who's already viewed with suspicion. Supplies might become hard to obtain. Neighbors might stop calling. Medical assistance might be unavailable when you need it most." The threat was delivered with cool politeness, but its implications were crystal clear. Victoria Morrison had the social connections and family influence to make Eleanor's life impossible if she chose to use them. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm explaining reality. You're an unmarried pregnant woman with no family connections and a questionable past. Your continued presence here is causing problems for respected members of the community. People will naturally choose sides, and I think you'll find they don't choose yours." Eleanor stared at the beautiful, composed woman who'd just threatened to destroy her life with such casual cruelty. This was the woman Clayton was expected to marry, the one who would bear his children and share his future. The contrast between Victoria's cold calculation and Clayton's genuine warmth was so stark it was almost comical. "Miss Morrison, I won't be driven away by threats or social pressure. This is my home, and I intend to stay, even if it means destroying Clayton's future. Because that's what you're doing, whether you admit it or not. Every day you remain here, his reputation suffers more damage. His father has already threatened to cut him off completely if he doesn't end his association with you. Then perhaps Mr. Hartwell should marry you immediately and put all speculation to rest. He should, but he won't as long as he holds on to whatever fantasy he's built around you." Victoria stood to leave, her movements precise and controlled. "Miss Sullivan, I'm going to give you time to think about what I've said, to consider whether your selfish desire to stay here is worth ruining the life of a good man who deserves better than to be destroyed by misguided chivalry." After Victoria left, Eleanor sat in her chair and stared at the baby cradle she'd crafted with such hope. Everything she'd built here, the cabin, the preparations for winter, the dream of independence, suddenly felt fragile and temporary. Not because of Victoria's threats, which Eleanor could probably weather, but because of the terrible realization that her mere existence was indeed damaging Clayton in ways she couldn't prevent or repair. She'd come to Montana to escape the consequences of her past mistakes, but instead she'd created new problems that threatened someone she'd grown to care about more than she'd ever intended. The isolation she'd craved had become a prison, and the independence she'd fought for felt hollow when it came at the cost of Clayton's future. The baby stirred restlessly, as if sensing her distress, and Eleanor placed her hands on her belly with a heavy heart. Soon she would be responsible for making decisions that affected not just herself, but an innocent child who deserved better than a mother whose past kept creating problems in the present. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in deceptive purity, while Eleanor wrestled with the knowledge that love, no matter how genuine, wasn't always enough to overcome the practical realities of life. Sometimes caring about someone meant making choices that felt like betrayal, even when they came from the deepest places of the heart. The faded wedding ring had been hidden in the bottom of Eleanor's trunk for so long that she'd almost forgotten its existence. Now, as she held it up to the firelight, the thin gold band seemed to mock everything she'd built her new life around. The inscription inside was still visible despite years of wear. CW to ES, Forever United, June 1872. Charles. Whitmore to Eleanor Sullivan. A promise that had lasted exactly 18 months before crumbling under the weight of his disgust and her shame. Eleanor's hands shook as she stared at the ring, memories flooding back despite her efforts to keep them buried. The elaborate Boston wedding, the honeyed words of devotion, the gradual revelation of Charles's true nature as the novelty of marriage wore off. She'd thought herself free of him when he'd walked out, divorce papers in hand, but the legal reality was more complicated than emotional freedom. A sharp knock at her door made her jump, the ring falling from nerveless fingers to roll across the floor. Eleanor scrambled to retrieve it, heart pounding with irrational fear. No one knew about Charles, about the marriage that had never been properly dissolved, about the legal complications that made her situation far more precarious than anyone imagined. She opened the door to find Clayton standing on her porch, snow dusting his dark hair and his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. 3 weeks of separation had only made him more handsome, and Eleanor felt her carefully constructed defenses waver at the sight of him. "Clayton, I thought, your father forbade you to come here." "My father forbids a lot of things. That doesn't mean I have to obey them all." Clayton's gaze searched her face with an intensity that made her want to retreat. "Eleanor, we need to talk. May I come in?" Every instinct urged her to refuse, to maintain the distance that protected them both from gossip and heartbreak. But the ring in her pocket felt like a weight dragging her toward honesty, and suddenly she was tired of carrying secrets alone. "Of course." Clayton entered and immediately noticed the changes in her appearance, the shadows under her eyes, the way she moved more carefully, the subtle signs of stress that 3 weeks of isolation had carved into her features. "You look exhausted." "I'm fine, just the usual discomforts of pregnancy." "Eleanor, don't lie to me. Something's wrong. I can see it in your face." She turned away from his perceptive gaze, busying herself with adjusting the fire. "Nothing's wrong. I'm simply preparing for the baby's arrival and managing the challenges of winter." "Is that why?" "Victoria Morrison felt the need to pay you a visit, to help with winter preparations." Eleanor's hands stilled on the fireplace poker. "You know about that?" "Victoria made sure I knew. She took great pleasure in describing her conversation with you, particularly the part where she threatened to make your life here impossible if you didn't leave Montana. She's concerned about your reputation, about the gossip." "I don't give a damn about the gossip, and neither should you." Eleanor turned to face him, seeing the familiar, stubborn set of his jaw that meant he'd made up his mind about something. "Clayton, the gossip isn't just idle chatter. It's damaging your future. Your relationship with your family." "My relationship with my family was damaged long before you arrived in Montana. And as for my future, I'm perfectly capable of deciding what that should look like." "Are you?" "Because from what I understand, your father has threatened to disown you if you don't marry Victoria Morrison immediately." Clayton's expression darkened. "My father has threatened many things over the years. Most of them proved to be empty bluster designed to manipulate me into compliance. And if they're not empty this time, if you lose your inheritance, your place at the ranch, your social standing, all for what? A pregnant woman you barely know?" "I know everything I need to know about you." "No, you don't." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, fueled by the guilt of her hidden secrets. "You know what I've chosen to tell you, which isn't the same thing at all." Clayton studied her face carefully, as if sensing undercurrents he couldn't quite identify. "Then tell me the rest. Tell me what you're holding back." Eleanor felt the ring burning like a coal in her pocket. This was her moment to confess everything, to finally trust someone with the complete truth about her past. But the words seemed to stick in her throat, trapped by years of self-protection and fear. "There's nothing to tell, Eleanor. I've been patient. I've respected your privacy, your need for space, your determination to handle everything alone. But I can't keep pretending that what's happening between us isn't real." "Nothing is happening between us, isn't it?" Clayton moved closer, his voice dropping to the gentle tone that always made her defenses crumble. "Because the way you look at me, the way you smile when you think I'm not watching, the way you tense up whenever I mention leaving, that doesn't feel like nothing." Eleanor backed away until she hit the cabin wall, feeling trapped between his intensity and her own conflicted emotions. "Whatever you think you see, you're mistaken. I came here to build a life for myself and my child. I don't have room for romantic complications." "What if I'm not a complication? What if I'm the solution?" "To what problem?" "To the problem of you facing everything alone. To the problem of raising a child without a father. To the problem of two people who could be happy together if they'd stop being afraid of what other people think." The simple sincerity in his voice nearly broke her resolve. How easy it would be to tell him everything, to trust that love could overcome the legal and social obstacles standing between them. But the ring in her pocket was a reminder that her situation was far more complicated than he knew. "Clayton, you don't understand. My past, my circumstances, they're more complicated than you realize." "Then help me understand. Tell me what's really going on." Eleanor took a shaky breath, knowing she was about to destroy whatever fantasy he'd built around their relationship. "The baby I'm carrying, the father isn't some nameless stranger who abandoned me. He's my husband." The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and confusion across Clayton's features. For a long moment he simply stared at her, processing the implications of what she'd just revealed. "Your husband?" "Yes, Charles Whitmore of Boston. We were married in June of 1872. Eleanor pulled the ring from her pocket, holding it out like evidence of her deception. "The marriage was troubled from the beginning. When he discovered I was pregnant, he assumed the child wasn't his and filed for divorce. But legal proceedings take time, and the paperwork was never finalized." Clayton's face went through a series of expressions: shock, confusion, and finally something that looked almost like relief. "So you're still legally married?" "Yes. Which means everything I've told you about being independent, about building a life alone, it's all been a lie. I'm not a fallen woman making a brave new start. I'm a married woman whose husband abandoned her, carrying a child he refuses to acknowledge as his own." "Eleanor, do you understand now why I can't let myself care about you? Why I have to keep pushing you away? I'm not free to love anyone, Clayton. I may never be free." Eleanor sank into her chair, exhausted by the weight of confession. She'd expected Clayton to react with anger or disgust, to realize that she'd been deceiving him about the fundamental facts of her situation. Instead, he knelt beside her chair and took her trembling hands in his. "Eleanor, look at me," she raised, her eyes reluctantly, prepared to see disappointment or betrayal in his expression. Instead, she found only the same gentle concern that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "Do you really think that changes anything?" "Of course it changes everything. I'm married, Clayton, legally bound to a man who rejected me and our child. Even if Charles agreed to finalize the divorce, the scandal would follow me forever. I'm not someone you can build a respectable life with. Respectable according to whom? The same people who are already gossiping about us. The same society that would see you and your child suffer rather than acknowledge that sometimes marriages fail? Respectable according to the law, according to your family, according to every standard that matters in the world you come from." Clayton was quiet for a long moment, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on the backs of her hands. When he spoke, his voice held a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her. "Eleanor, what if I told you that none of that matters to me? What if I said I'd rather build something real with you, complicated legal situation and all, than live a lie with someone else? I'd say you're not thinking clearly. The obstacles aren't just social, they're legal. Even if you were willing to overlook my married status, any children we might have together would be illegitimate. Your inheritance, your family's reputation, your standing in the community, everything would be compromised. Then we'll build something new. Start our own ranch, create our own community, make our own rules about what constitutes a family. The passionate conviction in his voice made Eleanor's heart ache with longing. Clayton, you're talking about giving up everything you've worked for, everything your family expects. I'm talking about choosing love over obligation, choosing authenticity over appearances, choosing a future I help create rather than one that's been mapped out for me since birth. And what about Victoria Morrison? What about the engagement your father expects you to announce? Victoria and I had a very enlightening conversation after her visit to you. She made it clear that she views our marriage as a business arrangement, rather than a romantic partnership. When I suggested we call off the engagement, she seemed more relieved than heartbroken. Eleanor stared at him in amazement. You broke your engagement? I postponed it indefinitely, which amounts to the same thing. Victoria will find someone else to marry, someone who shares her vision of marriage as a social and economic alliance. She deserves that, and I deserve something different. Something different like what? Like the possibility of waking up every morning next to someone who challenges me to be better than I am. Like building a life with someone who understands the value of hard work and isn't afraid to get her hands dirty. Like raising children who learn that worth comes from character rather than social standing. Clayton's description painted a picture so appealing that Eleanor could almost see it. A future where love mattered more than legal technicalities, where two people could create their own definition of family and respectability. But the rational part of her mind, hardened by experience and disappointment, insisted on acknowledging the obstacles that romantic vision couldn't overcome. Clayton, even if Charles agreed to the divorce, it would take years to finalize. Years during which we couldn't marry, couldn't legitimize any relationship between us. Could you really live with that uncertainty? I've been living with uncertainty since the day I met you. At least this way, we'd be facing it together. And if he refuses to grant the divorce, if he decides to fight it out of spite or stubbornness, Charles can be vindictive when his pride is wounded. Then we'll find another way, move somewhere divorce laws are more favorable, or simply live as common law spouses and let the legal formalities sort themselves out eventually. Eleanor pulled her hands free from his, needing distance to think clearly. You make it sound so simple, but real life is more complicated than romantic gestures. What about when the novelty wears off and you realize what you've sacrificed? What about when your children ask why their parents weren't properly married? What about when you're 50 years old and wonder what your life might have been if you'd made different choices? What about wondering what my life might have been if I'd been brave enough to fight for what I wanted, instead of settling for what was expected? The question hung between them like a challenge, forcing Eleanor to confront her own fears and motivations. Was she protecting Clayton from making a terrible mistake, or was she protecting herself from the vulnerability that came with being truly loved? I need time to think, she said finally. This is too important to decide based on emotion alone. Clayton nodded, though she could see the effort it cost him to accept her request for space. How much time? I don't know. Enough to consider all the implications, to contact Charles about finalizing the divorce, to figure out what's actually possible rather than just dreaming about what might be ideal. Eleanor, while you're thinking, remember this. I'm not asking you to take a leap of faith based on pretty words and romantic promises. I'm asking you to consider building something real with someone who sees you exactly as you are and loves you anyway. After Clayton left, Eleanor sat by her fire and stared at the wedding ring that had started this whole conversation. The simple gold band represented so many things. Promises broken, trust betrayed, hopes disappointed, but it also represented the legal reality she couldn't escape, no matter how much she wanted to believe in the possibility of a different future. The baby stirred beneath her ribs, reminding her that soon she would be responsible for making decisions that affected more than just herself. Did she have the right to burden her child with the complications of her own past? Did she have the right to let Clayton sacrifice his secure future for an uncertain life with someone who might never be legally free to marry him? Or did she have the right to deny herself and her child the possibility of a loving family, simply because that family didn't conform to society's narrow definitions of respectability? As the fire burned lower and the cabin grew quiet around her, Eleanor found herself facing the most difficult decision of her life, whether to trust love enough to fight for it or to protect everyone involved by maintaining the safe distance. In that had kept her heart intact, but achingly alone. The bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon had arrived that morning, delivered by a rider who'd braved the worst blizzard of the winter to reach Eleanor's remote cabin. Clayton's handwriting was unmistakable on the outer wrapping, but inside were documents that would change everything. Legal papers from Boston, a letter from Charles Whitmore's attorney, and Clayton's own passionate words declaring his intentions regardless of the outcome. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read Charles's response to her request for divorce finalization. After months of silence, he had finally deigned to reply, and his answer was exactly what she'd feared: an absolute refusal to grant the divorce, coupled with threats to pursue legal action if she continued to embarrass the Whitmore family name by her current circumstances. But it was Clayton's letter that made her heart race with equal parts hope and terror. Eleanor, I've enclosed Charles Whitmore's response, as you requested, along with my attorney's analysis of your legal options. The news isn't good. Massachusetts law heavily favors husbands in divorce proceedings, and Whitmore's social connections make challenging his refusal extremely difficult. But I want you to know that my feelings haven't changed. If anything, they've grown stronger during these weeks of separation. I've spent the time researching alternatives, and I believe we have options that don't require us to wait for Whitmore's cooperation. The Colorado Territory has enacted more progressive divorce laws. If we were to relocate there, you could file for divorce on grounds of abandonment, and the proceedings would likely be resolved within a year. I know what I'm asking, that you trust me enough to start over again in an unfamiliar place, that you risk everything on the possibility that love can overcome legal obstacles. I'm not asking lightly. I've severed ties with my father over this decision, and he's made good on his threat to cut me off financially, but I've managed to secure financing for a small ranch in Colorado near Denver where we could build something together. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be the comfortable life you might have had otherwise, but it would be ours. The baby is due soon, and I know you're facing that challenge alone. Whatever you decide about our future, please know that I want to be there for both of you, not out of obligation or pity, but because I love you and I want to be part of the family you're creating. I'm leaving the choice entirely in your hands. If you want me to leave you alone, I'll respect that decision. But if you're willing to take a chance on building something real together, I'll be waiting. With all my love, Clayton P.S. I've enclosed something that belongs to you, regardless of what you decide. Eleanor set the letter aside with shaking hands and reached for the small wrapped object at the bottom of the bundle. Inside the brown paper was her father's wooden cross, the one she'd treasured since childhood. But now it was mounted on a simple silver chain, transformed from a keepsake into something she could wear close to her heart. The gesture was so thoughtful, so perfectly understanding of what the cross meant to her, that Eleanor felt tears spill. Despite her efforts to remain composed, Clayton had seen her holding it during one of his visits, had listened when she'd told him about her father's faith and gentle wisdom, and had somehow known that she needed that connection to her past. As she faced an uncertain future, a sudden sharp pain in her lower back made Eleanor gasp and drop the cross. The pain intensified, radiating around to her belly in a way that made her breath catch. For a moment, she wondered if it was simply the emotional stress of reading Clayton's letter. But then another contraction hit, stronger and more insistent than the first. The baby was coming. Eleanor looked out the window at the blizzard raging outside and felt panic rise in her throat. She was at least 3 weeks from her due date, alone in a cabin miles from help, with no way to contact anyone, even if the storm weren't making travel impossible. The irony was cruel. Clayton's letter had been delivered just hours before she would need him most desperately. Another contraction gripped her, longer and more intense than the previous ones, and Eleanor knew with growing certainty that this was no false alarm. After months of preparation and planning, her child had chosen the worst possible moment to make its entrance into the world. She forced herself to think practically, despite the fear threatening to overwhelm her. She had clean linens prepared, water heating on the stove, everything she'd been able to gather for an unassisted birth. She'd read every book she could find on midwifery, had questioned other women about their experiences, had tried to prepare for every possibility, but theoretical knowledge felt inadequate when faced with the reality of labor beginning during a blizzard that made help impossible to summon. Eleanor managed to get to her feet between contractions, gathering the supplies she'd prepared and arranging them near the bed. The pain was coming more frequently now, building to peaks that made her gasp and clutch the furniture for support. She'd known labor would be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated how the combination of pain and fear would make clear thinking nearly impossible. As another contraction peaked, Eleanor found herself thinking about Clayton's letter and the choice he'd offered her. A few hours ago, the decision had seemed impossibly complex, fraught with social and legal complications that defied easy resolution. Now, facing the prospect of bringing her child into the world alone, the complications seemed less important. Then the fundamental question, did she want to face life's challenges alone? Or did she want a partner who would stand beside her regardless of what society or the law dictated? The answer, she realized with startling clarity, had been obvious for weeks. She'd been so focused on protecting Clayton from the consequences of choosing her that she'd failed to consider whether he was capable of making that choice for himself. She'd been treating him like a naive romantic rather than a grown man who understood exactly what he was risking and had decided it was worth. Between contractions, Eleanor made her way to her writing desk and pulled out paper and pen. If she was going to die in childbirth, a possibility she couldn't ignore given her circumstances, she wanted Clayton to know that she'd chosen love over fear, even if she hadn't been brave enough to tell him so while she had the chance. Clayton, your letter arrived just as my labor began, and I'm writing this between contractions to tell you what I should have said weeks ago. Yes. Yes to Colorado. Yes to building something new together. Yes to taking a chance on love, even when the odds seem impossible. I've been so afraid of being hurt again that I nearly threw away the best thing that's ever happened to me. You were right. I was protecting myself by pushing you away, not protecting you. I'm sorry for not trusting you to make your own decisions about what risks are worth taking. If something happens to me during this birth, please know that you've given me the greatest gift possible. The knowledge that real love exists, and that I was brave enough to recognize it even if I wasn't brave enough to fight for it soon enough. Take care of our child if I can't. Teach them that love matters more than convention, that family is defined by choice rather than law, and that sometimes the most important decisions require the most courage. I love you. I should have said it months ago. Eleanor. Eleanor sealed the letter and placed it prominently on the kitchen table, where it would be found if anyone came looking for her. Then she returned to the bedroom and tried to focus on the task ahead, bringing her child safely into the world, despite the storm raging outside and the fear raging within her heart. The contractions were coming faster now, each one building to a peak that seemed to tear through her entire body. Eleanor had always prided herself on her strength, but this was beyond anything she'd ever experienced. The pain was so intense it made her vision blur, so overwhelming that she found herself crying out despite her determination to remain stoic. Between contractions, she tried to remember everything she'd read about the stages of labor, about how to know when it was time to push, about what to do if something went wrong. But the theoretical knowledge felt useless when applied to the reality of her situation. She was flying blind, guided only by instinct and the desperate hope that women had been giving birth without medical assistance for millennia. As the storm continued to rage outside her windows and the contractions continued to intensify, Eleanor found herself thinking about all the choices that had led her to this moment. The decision to leave Boston, to buy land in Montana, to build a life alone rather than accept charity or pity. Each choice had seemed necessary at the time, driven by a determination to prove that she could survive anything without depending on others. But now, as she faced the most challenging experience of her life completely alone, Eleanor understood that independence and isolation weren't the same thing. She could be strong and self-reliant while still accepting love and support from people who offered it freely. She could build a life on her own terms while still allowing others to be part of that life. The realization came with another contraction so intense it drove all other thoughts from her mind. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not, whether help was available or not, whether she was brave enough for what lay ahead or not. All she could do now was survive the next few hours and hope that dawn would bring not just the end of the storm, but the beginning of the life she'd finally found the courage to choose. Outside, the wind howled with the fury of a Montana winter, but inside the cabin, Eleanor gripped her father's cross and prepared to bring her child into a world where love mattered more than law, where family was defined by choice rather than convention, and where sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the most challenging circumstances. The baby was coming, the storm was raging, and Eleanor was about to discover whether her strength was equal to the test that lay ahead. The makeshift blanket had been cut from Clayton's finest white shirt, the one he'd worn to church every Sunday since arriving in Montana. Now it lay ready beside Eleanor's bed, soft cotton prepared to welcome the child who would change everything. She'd found it wrapped carefully in his letter bundle, along with a note explaining that every baby deserved something made with love. For their first moments in the world, Eleanor gripped the bedpost as another contraction tore through her, stronger than any before. The storm outside seemed to be matching the intensity of her labor, wind howling against the cabin walls with a fury that made the whole structure shudder. She'd lost track of time. Was it still afternoon, or had evening fallen while she struggled with the increasing waves of pain? The contractions were coming so close together now that she barely had time to breathe between them. Her body felt completely beyond her control, driven by forces more powerful than anything she'd ever experienced. Every book she'd read about childbirth had described this stage, but none had prepared her for the overwhelming intensity of actually living through it. Another contraction peaked, and Eleanor heard herself cry out despite her determination to remain strong. The sound echoed in the small cabin, mixing with the howl of wind to create a symphony of struggle that seemed to fill the entire world. Through the haze of pain, she thought she heard something else, the sound of hoofbeats approaching through the storm. But that was impossible. No one would be traveling in weather like this, and even if they were, how could she hear anything over the wind? The contraction subsided enough for her to focus, and she realized the sound was real. Someone was indeed approaching the cabin, riding hard through conditions that should have made travel impossible. Eleanor felt a wild surge of hope mixed with disbelief. Had Clayton somehow known she needed him? Had he braved the storm based on nothing more than intuition? Heavy boots on her porch, urgent pounding on the door, and then Clayton's voice cutting through the wind. "Eleanor, Eleanor, are you all right?" She tried to call out, but another contraction hit at that moment, stealing her breath and voice. The pain was so intense, she could only grip the bedpost and ride it out, tears streaming down her face. The pounding on the door grew more urgent, and then she heard the sound of the latch lifting. Clayton burst into the cabin, snow-covered and wild-eyed with concern, bringing the scent of cold air and pine with him. "Eleanor, where are you?" His voice carried the edge of panic as he searched the small space. "Here," she managed to gasp between contractions. In the bedroom, Clayton appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to handling emergencies. His gaze swept over her obvious distress, the prepared supplies, the evidence that labor was well advanced. "How long?" he asked, moving immediately to her side. "Hours, since this morning." Eleanor gripped his hand as another contraction began to build. "The baby's coming early. I can't stop it." "You don't need to stop it. Babies come when they're ready." Clayton's voice was calm, steady, completely at odds with the chaos of the storm outside. "How far apart are the contractions?" "Close. Very close. I think it's almost time." Clayton nodded, rolling up his sleeves with practiced efficiency. "Have you felt the urge to push?" Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks despite her pain. Having Clayton here was a relief beyond measure, but the intimate nature of childbirth still embarrassed her. "Yes, growing stronger with each contraction." "Then we don't have much time." Clayton moved around the small bedroom, checking her preparations and adding items from his own saddlebags. "Eleanor, I need you to know, I've helped. Delivered dozens of calves and foals. I'm not a doctor, but I understand the basics of birth." "How did you know to come?" Eleanor asked between contractions. "How did you know I needed you?" Clayton's expression grew serious. "I've been riding the boundaries every day, checking for signs that you might need help. When the storm hit this hard, I knew if you went into labor, you'd be completely isolated. I couldn't stand the thought of you facing this alone." Another contraction hit, stronger than any before, and Eleanor felt the overwhelming urge to push. Her body seemed to be taking over completely, driven by instincts older than thought or fear. "Clayton, I think the baby's coming now." "All right. Let's get you more comfortable." Clayton helped her into a better position, his movements gentle but confident. "Remember, your body knows what to do. Just follow its lead." Eleanor nodded, trying to trust in the wisdom of countless generations of women who had done this before her. But as the next contraction peaked, she found herself gripping Clayton's hand with desperate strength. "I'm scared," she whispered. "What if something goes wrong? What if I'm not strong enough?" Clayton's eyes met hers, and she saw complete faith. Reflected there, "Eleanor, you're the strongest person I've ever known. You've survived abandonment, built a home with your bare hands, and faced every challenge alone. You can do this. Not alone this time. No, not alone this time." The contractions were constant now, each one bringing the baby closer to the world. Eleanor found herself drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. Her body, working with single-minded determination despite her exhaustion and fear. "I can see the head," Clayton said suddenly, his voice filled with wonder. "Eleanor, your baby's almost here." Another contraction, stronger than any before, and Eleanor felt the baby's shoulders emerge. One more push, and suddenly the pressure was gone, replaced by the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, the lusty cry of a newborn taking its first breath. "It's a girl," Clayton announced, his voice thick with emotion. "Eleanor, you have a daughter." Through her tears, Eleanor saw Clayton lifting the baby, wrapping her in the soft cotton blanket he'd provided. The tiny girl was perfect, all pink, skin and dark hair, with lungs that announced her displeasure at leaving her warm cocoon. "She's beautiful," Eleanor whispered, reaching out with trembling hands. Is she healthy?" "She's perfect." Clayton placed the baby in Eleanor's, arms, and the world seemed to shift on its axis. Nothing had ever felt as right as the weight of her daughter against her chest, the warmth of new life that she had created and brought safely into the world. The baby's cries quieted as she settled against Eleanor's skin, tiny fingers curling. With instinctive strength, Eleanor traced the delicate features with one finger, marveling at the perfect miniature fingernails, the way the baby's eyes seemed to focus on her face with ancient wisdom. "Hello, little one," Eleanor whispered. "I'm your mama." Clayton busied himself with the practical tasks that followed birth, his movements efficient and careful. Eleanor was dimly aware of his ministrations, but her attention was completely captured by the miracle in her arms. "What will you name her?" Clayton asked softly. Eleanor looked up at him, seeing the way he watched both her and the baby with an expression of such tender protectiveness that her heart swelled with love. "Hope," she said without hesitation. "Her name is Hope. Hope Sullivan." Clayton repeated, and the name sounded perfect in his voice. "Hope Hartwell," Eleanor corrected quietly, meeting his eyes with newfound certainty. "If you still want us." Clayton's face transformed with joy so complete it took Eleanor's breath away. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. About Colorado, about starting over, about building something real together. I'm sure about all of it." Clayton leaned down and kissed her forehead gently, then brushed a finger across the baby's cheek. "Then we'll be a family, all three of us." Outside, the storm was beginning to subside, the wind's howl fading to a whisper. Inside the cabin, a new family was taking shape, not bound by law or convention, but by choice and love and the shared commitment to build something beautiful from the fragments of their individual pasts. As Eleanor held her daughter close and felt Clayton's strong presence beside them both, she realized that sometimes the most precious things came from the most unexpected circumstances. Love hadn't rescued her, she'd rescued herself. But love had recognized her strength and chosen to stand beside it, creating something stronger than either could have built alone. The baby stirred in her arms, making soft sounds that spoke of contentment and security. Eleanor looked down at her daughter's peaceful face and felt a certainty she'd never experienced before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles they would have to overcome, they would face them together. Hope had been born into a storm, but she would grow up surrounded by love that had proven itself strong enough to weather any tempest. The new cabin door had been Clayton's idea, built together during Eleanor's recovery from childbirth. Made from solid pine and reinforced with iron hinges they'd forged themselves. It represented everything their future would be, strong, practical, and created through shared effort. Now, 3 weeks after Hope's birth, it stood as a symbol of the threshold they were preparing to cross together. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair by the fire, nursing her daughter while Clayton finished packing their belongings. Tomorrow, they would leave Montana for Colorado territory, closing the door on the life she'd built alone to open another with the family they'd chosen to become. The decision hadn't been easy. Despite the certainty she'd felt during Hope's birth, leaving the cabin she'd built with her own hands felt like abandoning a part of herself, even though she knew it was necessary. Charles Whitmore's latest letter, delivered just days after the baby's arrival, had made staying in Montana impossible. "Eleanor, I have learned through certain social connections that you have given birth to a child while still legally married to me. This brazen flouting of moral, law and social convention cannot be tolerated. I am prepared to take legal action to claim custody of the child as my legitimate heir, regardless of its actual parentage. Your continued defiance of propriety has brought shame upon the Whitmore name. I demand that you return to Boston immediately with the child, or I will be forced to involve the authorities in resolving this matter. I trust you will see reason and comply with this reasonable request. Charles Whitmore." The threat had been clear enough. Return to a loveless marriage and surrender control of her daughter's future, or fight a legal battle she couldn't win against a man with unlimited resources and social connections. But Clayton had offered a third option: disappear completely, start fresh in Colorado territory, where the Whitmore name carried no weight and different laws might offer better protection. "Are you having second thoughts?" Clayton asked, noticing her contemplative expression as he secured the last of their supplies. "About leaving? No. About what we're asking you to sacrifice. Sometimes." Clayton set down the rope he'd been coiling and moved to sit on the arm of her chair. "Eleanor, we've been through this. I'm not sacrificing anything I want to keep. Your inheritance, your family's approval, your standing in the community. My father's money comes with too many strings attached. My family's approval was never mine to begin with. It belonged to whoever they wanted me to be, not who I actually am. And the community—" Clayton gestured toward the window, where snow still covered the ground, despite the approaching spring. "This community never would have accepted us anyway. Not really." Eleanor shifted Hope to her shoulder, patting the baby's back gently. "What about regrets? What about when you're 40 years old and working twice as hard for half the comfort you could have had if you'd married Victoria Morrison? What about when I'm 40 years old and realize I chose a life that actually belongs to me?" The simple confidence in his voice still amazed Eleanor after all these weeks. Clayton approached their uncertain future with the same steady determination he brought to every challenge, as if love was sufficient foundation for whatever they might need to build. "Your mother stopped by yesterday while you were hunting," Eleanor said quietly. "She brought more baby clothes and some preserves for the journey." Clayton's expression grew cautious. "How was that conversation?" "Difficult. She's proud of you for following your heart, but terrified about what it might cost. She wanted to know if I understood what I was asking you to give up." "And what did you tell her?" "That I'd asked you to give up nothing. That you'd chosen this path yourself, despite every effort I made to discourage you." Catherine Hartwell had been the hardest part of leaving Montana in many ways. Unlike Clayton's father, who had responded to their plans with rage and threats of permanent estrangement, his mother had offered grudging understanding tinged with maternal worry. "She loves you," Eleanor continued, "even if she can't approve of your choices. I know. That's what makes leaving harder, knowing I'm disappointing the one person whose opinion actually matters to me." She also said something else. Eleanor paused, remembering the older woman's parting words. She said that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting someone make their own mistakes, even when you're certain they're wrong. Does she think we're making a mistake? She thinks we're taking enormous risks for uncertain rewards. But she also said she'd rather see you happy and poor than miserable and rich. Clayton was quiet for a moment, processing his mother's message. Hope had fallen asleep in Eleanor's arms, her tiny face peaceful in the firelight. The sight of his daughter, for he'd claimed her as his own from the moment of her birth, always seemed to reinforce his conviction about their chosen path. "Eleanor, do you remember the first time I found you here? How you looked splitting firewood with such fierce determination. I remember you thought I was crazy for attempting to build a homestead alone. I thought you were the most remarkable woman I'd ever seen. Here was someone who'd rather face impossible odds than accept a life that didn't belong to her, someone who'd chosen struggle over surrender, authenticity over comfort." Eleanor felt tears threaten at the memory. "I was so angry at you for showing up, so determined to prove I didn't need help from anyone." "You didn't need help. You needed a partner. There's a difference, is there? Help implies temporary assistance, with tasks you can't manage alone. Partnership means sharing the load, because two people working together can accomplish things that neither could achieve individually." The distinction resonated with Eleanor in ways that surprised her. She'd spent so much energy insisting on complete independence that she'd failed to recognize the possibility of interdependence. Two strong people choosing to build something together, not out of weakness, but out of strength. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Clayton rose to answer it, and Eleanor heard the murmur of familiar voices. Johann and Maria Kowalski. "Come to say goodbye." "Miss Sullivan?" Maria said, bustling into the cabin with her arms full of food and baby clothes. "We could not let you leave without proper provisions for the journey." Johann followed more slowly, his weathered face creased with concern. "The trail to Colorado is hard this time of year. Much snow still in the high passes." "We'll manage," Clayton assured him. "We're planning to take the southern route, through Denver. It's longer but safer with the baby." "Good, good," Johann nodded approvingly. "You have telegraph address for—" "When you arrive, Maria will worry until she knows you're safe." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. She'd worked so hard to remain aloof from her neighbors, to avoid the complications of community involvement. But the Kowalskis' genuine concern reminded her that isolation and independence weren't synonymous. "We'll send word as soon as we're settled," she promised. Maria approached the rocking chair, her eyes soft as she looked down at Hope. "Such a beautiful baby. She will grow strong and happy with parents who love her so much." "We hope so. I know so." Maria's voice carried the certainty of a woman who'd raised 6 children of her own. "Love is the most important thing. Everything else, money, social position, family approval, these things are nice, but love is what makes children grow into good people." After the Kowalskis left, Eleanor and Clayton finished their preparations in companionable silence. The cabin that had been her refuge would soon belong to someone else. Clayton had arranged to sell it to a young homesteader from Nebraska who needed exactly the kind of fresh start Eleanor had once sought. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Eleanor asked as they performed final checks on their travel arrangements. "I think we're doing the brave thing. Whether it turns out to be right or wrong, at least we'll know we chose it ourselves. And if it goes badly, if Colorado doesn't offer the opportunities we hope for, then we'll figure out something else, together." The simple faith in his voice reminded Eleanor why she'd fallen in love with Clayton Hartwell in the first place. He approached uncertainty not with fear, but with curiosity, viewing obstacles as puzzles to be solved rather than insurmountable barriers. As they prepared for their last night in the cabin, Eleanor found herself thinking about the woman who'd arrived here 9 months ago. Pregnant, abandoned, determined to prove she could survive anything alone. That woman had been strong but brittle, independent but isolated, proud but afraid. The woman preparing to leave was still strong, but her strength was tempered by flexibility. Still independent, but no longer afraid of interdependence. Still proud, but proud of what she'd built, rather than what she'd survived. "Clayton," she said as they settled into bed with Hope sleeping peacefully between them. "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing who I could become, not just who I was when you found me." Clayton reached across their sleeping daughter to take Eleanor's hand. "Thank you for letting me become someone I actually wanted to be." Outside, the Montana wind sang through the pine trees one last time, carrying the scent of snow and possibility. Inside the cabin, a family prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but facing them with the confidence that comes from choosing love over fear, authenticity over convention, and partnership over the illusion of complete self-sufficiency. The new door would protect other dreamers now, but the family it had sheltered was ready to build fresh dreams in new territory, carrying nothing but hope and each other toward an uncertain but chosen future. The family garden stretched before them in neat rows of green abundance, testament to 3 years of careful tending and shared labor. Eleanor straightened from weeding the tomato plants, one hand on her lower back and the other shading her eyes, as she watched Clayton teaching 2-year-old Hope to identify the different vegetables they'd grown together. The Colorado soil had proven more generous than Montana's harsh ground, yielding crops that sustained both body and spirit. "Mama, look!" Hope's delighted squeal drew Eleanor's attention to where the toddler was pointing at a fat cucumber hiding beneath broad leaves. "Big one, very big," Eleanor agreed, smiling at her daughter's enthusiasm for everything the garden produced. Hope had inherited her father's easy confidence and her mother's determined spirit, creating a combination that promised interesting years ahead. Clayton scooped Hope into his arms, spinning her around until she giggled with pure joy. "Shall we pick it for dinner tonight?" "Yes, and flowers for the table." Eleanor watched them move through the garden together, Hope chattering constantly, while Clayton listened with the patient attention he brought to everything their daughter said. The sight filled her with the kind of contentment she'd never thought possible during those lonely months in Montana. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made them all look up. A lone rider was approaching their ranch house, a modest but comfortable home they'd built during their second year in Colorado, when the success of their cattle operation had finally allowed them to expand beyond the initial one-room cabin. "Company," Clayton observed, settling Hope on his shoulders for a better view. "Looks like official business." Eleanor felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that still accompanied unexpected visitors. 3 years hadn't completely erased the wariness born of past troubles, though each passing month brought greater confidence in the life they'd built. The rider proved to be a young man wearing the uniform of a telegraph messenger, and Eleanor's apprehension deepened. Telegraph messages rarely brought good news, especially to people trying to live quietly beyond the reach of their former lives. "Mrs. Hartwell?" the messenger asked, consulting his paperwork. Eleanor and Clayton exchanged glances. They'd been living as husband and wife since arriving in Colorado, common law marriage being recognized in the territory even without formal ceremony. The legal fiction had become emotional truth so gradually that Eleanor sometimes forgot they weren't officially wed. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell," she confirmed, accepting the telegram with hands that trembled slightly. The message was brief, but momentous. "Charles Whitmore died. Sudden heart attack. Stop divorce proceedings. Unnecessary. Stop. You are free to remarry. Stop condolences and congratulations. Stop. Attorney Blackwood, Boston." Lenore read the telegram twice before the full import registered. Charles was dead. Her marriage was dissolved by death rather than law. She was finally legally free to build the life she'd already been living. "What is it?" Clayton asked, noting her stunned expression. Eleanor handed him the telegram, watching his face transform as he read the terse message. Hope, sensing the change in adult mood, grew quiet in her father's arms. "Well," Clayton said finally, "that's unexpected." "I don't know how to feel," Eleanor admitted. "Relief, certainly, but also guilt. I never wished him dead, despite everything. Of course you didn't. You're not that kind of person." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, processing the implications of this sudden change in their circumstances. Hope grew restless with the adult seriousness and wiggled until Clayton set her down to chase butterflies among the flower beds. "So," Clayton said eventually, "we can make it official now, if you want to." Eleanor looked at the man who'd been her partner in every meaningful way for 3 years, who'd claimed her daughter as his own, who'd built a life with her based on love rather than law. "Do we need to make it official?" "Need to?" "No. Want to." Clayton's expression grew thoughtful. "Maybe. Not because what we have isn't real already, but because I'd like to stand up in front of our friends and neighbors and declare publicly what we've been living privately. A celebration rather than a legal formality?" "Exactly." Eleanor considered this, thinking about how far they'd come from that first contentious meeting in her Montana clearing. Their relationship had been tested by financial hardship, social disapproval, and the practical challenges of starting over. In unfamiliar territory, it had survived and flourished not because of legal bonds, but because of mutual choice renewed daily. "Then yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Yes, I'd like that very much." Clayton's smile was like sunrise after a long night. "Really? Really? But nothing elaborate. Just something simple with the people who matter to us. The Kowalskis could come down from Montana. My mother might even make the trip if we gave her enough notice." Eleanor felt her heart warm at the mention of Catherine Hartwell, who had gradually thawed toward their unconventional arrangement over the past 3 years. The birth of Hope had helped. Grandchildren had a way of softening even the most principled objections to irregular situations. She'd love that, and Hope would enjoy having her grandmother here for the ceremony. "Gamma!" Hope called out from the flower bed, having learned that any mention of Clayton Hartwell meant presents and extra attention. "Yes, sweetheart. Gamma might come visit soon." As they walked back toward the house, Eleanor found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The woman who'd arrived in Montana Territory 3 years ago had been running from a life that didn't fit, desperate to prove she could survive alone. The woman walking through a Colorado garden. With her chosen family had learned that true strength lay not in isolation, but in the courage to trust and be trusted. Their ranch was modest by the standards of Clayton's family heritage, but it was theirs in ways that inherited wealth could never be. Every fence post, every improvement, every success had been earned through shared effort and mutual support. "Eleanor," Clayton said as they reached the porch, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you happy? Really happy? Not just content or satisfied, but truly happy?" Eleanor looked around at the life they'd built, the garden flourishing under. A careful tending, the house that rang with laughter and conversation, the daughter who would grow up knowing she was loved unconditionally. Then she looked at the man who'd seen her strength when she'd only felt her weakness, who'd chosen her when she'd been certain no one ever would again. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm happy in ways I never thought possible, even without the social position you grew up with, even without the security of family wealth. Especially without those things, this life belongs to us in ways that other life never could have." Clayton nodded, understanding passing between them, born of shared experience and mutual respect. They'd both discovered that the things they'd thought they wanted, approval, security, conformity, mattered far less than the things they'd built together through choice and effort. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching Hope chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Eleanor found herself thinking about the letter she'd write to Attorney Blackwood, formally closing the chapter of her life that had begun with such hope and ended with such disappointment. But mostly, she thought about the future spreading before them like the Colorado prairie, vast, with possibility, challenging but manageable. With the right partner, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with other people's definitions of success. Hope toddled over to climb into Eleanor's lap, warm and solid and perfect in the way only beloved children could be. "Mama, sing the garden song," Eleanor obliged, her voice soft in the evening air as she sang the simple melody she'd made up about planting and growing and tending the things that mattered most. Clayton's deeper voice joined hers on the chorus, their harmonies blending as naturally as their lives had intertwined. Later, after Hope had been tucked into bed and the evening chores completed, Eleanor and Clayton sat together, planning their wedding and their future. Not grand dreams of wealth or status, but practical hopes for expanding their herd, improving their land, and raising their daughter to understand that love was a choice made new each day, rather than a feeling that simply happened. The telegram that had changed everything lay on the kitchen table, but its importance had already faded. Charles Whitmore's death had given them legal freedom, but they'd been truly free for years, free to choose each other, free to build something authentic, free to define family and success and happiness on their own terms. Outside, the Colorado. Night settled over their valley with the kind of peace that came from work well done and love well tended. Inside their modest home, a family prepared for sleep, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but also knowing they would face them together. The garden would need watering in the morning, the cattle would need checking, and Hope would need the 100 small attentions that filled a parent's day. But those tasks felt like privileges rather than burdens when undertaken with willing hands and grateful hearts. Eleanor fell asleep that night with Clayton's arm around her and Hope's gentle breathing audible from the next room, thinking about seeds planted in harsh ground that had somehow grown into something beautiful beyond imagining. Love, she'd learned, was like that. It could take root in the most unlikely circumstances and flourish when tended with patience, care, and the courage to keep choosing it even when easier options presented themselves. The woman who'd built a cabin with her bare hands in the Montana wilderness had discovered something far more valuable than mere survival. She'd found a way to live fully, authentically and joyfully with people who loved her, not despite her complications, but because of the strength those complications had revealed. And that, Eleanor thought as sleep claimed her, was worth more than any inheritance, any social approval, any conventional success the world might offer in exchange.